The fluorescent lights of Arlington Hall hummed their eternal electric hymn as Anna Volkov pushed through the heavy steel door, her security badge still warm from the guard's suspicious inspection. October air clung to her coat, carrying whispers of a world balanced on the knife's edge of annihilation. Beyond these walls, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev circled each other like wolves, while Soviet missiles sat aimed at American cities from Cuban soil. Inside this converted girls' school turned fortress of secrets, rows of cipher clerks bent over their machines, translating the enemy's words before those words became mushroom clouds. Anna's heels clicked against linoleum that had once known the laughter of school children, now replaced by the clatter of typewriters decoding apocalypse. She could taste the metallic tang of fear in the recycled air, mixed with stale coffee and cigarette smoke. Every intercepted transmission they processed might contain the order that would end the world. Her supervisor barely glanced up. As she signed in for the night shift, his eyes bloodshot from 72 hours of crisis rotation. The other analysts looked like ghosts, pale faces illuminated by desk lamps in the cavernous room where shadows gathered thick in the corners. Anna settled at her station in the back row, the least important position given to the newest and youngest member of the team. Before her sat stacks of intercept sheets, Soviet naval communications already decrypted by the primary cipher teams, deemed routine and filed away. Tonight she would work alone. The graveyard hours when skeleton crews manned the listening posts while Washington slept its nervous sleep. Through the blacked-out windows, she could feel rather than see the darkness pressing against the glass, heavy with the weight of 12 million lives hanging in the balance of men's decisions. She opened the first folder, with hands steadier than her racing heart, remembering her father's warning delivered in urgent Russian the morning she left for this job. "Trust the patterns," he had whispered, "even when others call you crazy, especially then." His mathematician's mind had saved him once by seeing what others missed, carrying him across an ocean to freedom. Now Anna wondered if that same gift of sight had been passed down through blood, or if she was simply another frightened girl pretending at courage while the world prepared to burn. The pattern emerged from the static like a face appearing in fog. Anna had been sorting through a stack of routine Soviet naval transmissions for 3 hours when her eyes caught something that made her pencil pause mid-stroke. The cipher groups were correct, matching the decoded plaintext perfectly, yet underneath the obvious message about supply routes and weather conditions, something else pulsed with mathematical regularity. She blinked hard, rubbing her eyes, certain that exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind. But when she looked again, the anomaly remained, a secondary rhythm beating beneath the surface like a hidden heartbeat. The numbers appeared random to any casual observer, meaningless fragments scattered through otherwise mundane communications. Yet, to Anna's trained perception, they formed intervals, spacing patterns that repeated across multiple transmissions with impossible consistency. She pulled more files from the archive boxes, searching backward through intercepted messages from the previous weeks. The overhead lights flickered once, making shadows dance across her workspace as she spread papers in a growing constellation across her desk. Other analysts occasionally glanced her way, but quickly returned to their own urgent work, dismissing her midnight archaeology as the nervous energy of an inexperienced clerk. Anna's fingers moved faster now, her father's lessons flooding back, his voice teaching her to see mathematics as music, patterns as melodies that revealed themselves to patient ears. The anomalies existed in 17 separate transmissions, all from different Soviet operators, all dismissed by senior cryptanalysts as transmission errors or atmospheric interference. But Anna knew the difference between chaos and hidden order. At 11 minutes past midnight, she gathered her evidence and approached the shift supervisor's desk. He looked up with undisguised irritation, his coffee cup leaving rings on a folder marked Top Secret. She began explaining her discovery, pointing to the numerical patterns, the impossible consistency. but his expression shifted from irritation to condescension before she finished her second sentence. He cut her off with a raised hand, his voice carrying across the quiet room, ensuring everyone could hear him dismiss the junior clerk who dared interrupt real intelligence work. "Static noise," he declared. "Artifacts of ionospheric distortion that any experienced analyst would recognize immediately." Anna returned to her desk, cheeks burning, feeling the weight of dismissive stares following her retreat. But as she sat again before her papers, something hardened inside her chest, transforming embarrassment into determination. Her father had been called crazy too, right up until his predictions saved lives. She would continue alone then, trusting what her eyes could see and her mind could prove, even if it meant working through the night with only ghosts and flickering lights as witnesses. The truth existed in those numbers, singing its hidden song, and she would decode it whether anyone believed her or not. The apartment on 16th Street smelled of boiled cabbage and her father's cigarettes, cheap tobacco that left yellow stains on his fingers and filled their cramped rooms with acrid fog. Anna was 9 years old the first time she understood her father was afraid, truly afraid, in a way that went deeper than ordinary worry. A fear that lived in his bones and expressed itself through checking locks 3 times before bed and never standing near windows after dark. Dmitry Volkov had defected in '53, trading his position at a Soviet research institute for American protection, bringing with him mathematical secrets that made him valuable enough to extract but dangerous enough to haunt. He worked night shifts at a Georgetown laundry now, his brilliant mind that once calculated missile trajectories reduced to sorting shirts and pressing collars, while government handlers occasionally visited to ask questions about colleagues he'd left behind. Anna watched him shrink a little more each year, watched how he startled at unexpected knocks, how his hands shook when Cyrillic newspapers appeared in their building's lobby, evidence that other Russians lived nearby, watching perhaps, remembering perhaps. But in the evenings, when curtains were drawn and doors were locked, her father transformed back into the man he'd been, the mathematician whose patterns revealed hidden truths beneath surface chaos. He spread papers across their kitchen table, teaching Anna to see numbers as living things that spoke in frequencies and rhythms, mathematical music that only trained minds could hear. His method was unconventional, dismissed by American academics who couldn't understand why anyone would analyze encrypted communications like musical compositions, searching for melodic patterns in what appeared as random noise. Yet he'd proven himself twice before, identifying saboteurs through statistical anomalies in production reports, finding assassins through the rhythm of their cover stories. Anna absorbed everything, her young mind learning to perceive the invisible architecture beneath apparent randomness, seeing harmonies where others saw only discord. The fear never left their home, though, no matter how brilliant his mind remained. Her father kept a packed suitcase under his bed, cash taped inside the lining, always ready to run if the knock came at the wrong hour with the wrong voices behind it. He taught her his techniques with desperate intensity, as if transferring his gift before time ran out, before the past he'd fled finally caught up with present safety. She understood even then that he was giving her both weapon and burden, the ability to see what others missed, to find patterns in chaos and truth in lies. Those lessons echoed now in the silent halls of Arlington, in the dismissed transmissions covering her desk, in the hidden song only she could hear singing through Soviet static. The revelation came not through logic, but through music, through the memory of her father, hunched over their kitchen table, humming softly as numbers transformed into melodies. In his damaged, brilliant mind, Anna had tried everything else first, exhausted every conventional approach taught in her NSA training, applied every standard decryption protocol to the strange transmissions her superiors dismissed as atmospheric interference or equipment malfunction. But at 11 minutes past 9 on that October night, alone in the fluorescent hum of the analysis room, with cooling coffee and mounting desperation, She stopped trying to break the code and started listening to it instead. She wrote the cipher groups vertically rather than horizontally, assigned each number a musical note value using her father's system, and suddenly the random static resolved into something impossibly elegant, a secondary melody hidden beneath the primary encryption, like a counterpoint in Bach, invisible until you knew exactly how to listen. Her hands trembled as she mapped the pattern, pencil scratching across graph paper in the oppressive silence broken only by distant teletype machines and the building's ancient heating system, clanging through pipes. The method seemed insane, even to her, treating espionage like composition, searching for harmonic relationships in what every trained cryptanalyst would call meaningless noise. But her father had taught her that human beings couldn't help but create patterns, even when trying to generate randomness, that the Soviet cipher, Clark's embedding these secondary messages, would unconsciously impose structure, rhythm, a mathematical music audible only to those who stopped looking and started hearing. She tested her theory on 3 separate transmissions, found the same melodic architecture hiding beneath different surface encryptions, and felt the sick excitement of discovery mixed with the terrifying weight of what she'd found. This wasn't amateur tradecraft or isolated communication. This was systematic, sophisticated, a network operating with such confidence they'd hidden messages inside already encrypted traffic, assuming no one would ever think to look beyond the first layer. The room felt colder. Suddenly, as if history itself had shifted temperature, as if she'd opened a door that couldn't be closed again. Anna checked her work twice, then 3 times, applying her father's frequency method to transmission after transmission, watching the hidden layer emerge like invisible ink under heat. The pattern held, consistent and deliberate, proof that someone in Moscow Center had developed the same unconventional thinking her father possessed, had created a system so elegant it had operated undetected for months, perhaps years. She thought of Dmitry Volkov's shaking hands and yellow-stained fingers, his genius wasted on laundry and fear, and understood with perfect clarity why he'd taught her everything, why he'd passed his burden forward like a relay runner, handing off something precious and dangerous. The decoded numbers began forming coordinates, names, dates, and Anna realized she was staring at something vast and terrible, a conspiracy that reached further than she'd imagined possible, and dawn was still hours away. The first decoded message materialized on her notepad at 11:47, coordinates and a name that made her stomach clench like a fist closing around ice. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Ashford, Pentagon's Strategic Planning Division, followed by a series of numbers that could only be payment schedules and dead-drop locations. Anna's pencil hovered, motionless above the paper as understanding crashed through her, the weight of what she held transforming from abstract pattern into flesh and blood betrayal. She was 24 years old, a GS-7 clerk who'd been at Arlington Hall for exactly 7 months, and she'd just uncovered a Soviet penetration agent operating at the heart of American military planning during the most dangerous crisis humanity had ever faced. Her supervisors were men in their 50s who called her sweetheart and checked her work with visible skepticism, who dismissed these very transmissions 3 days ago as equipment malfunction when she'd first flagged them for review. The building around her seemed to pulse with new significance, every shadow suddenly suspicious, every distant footstep a potential threat. Anna thought of the protocol manual, the chain of command that required her to submit findings through her section chief, a balding analyst named Patterson, who'd made clear his opinion that women belonged in the typing pool rather than cryptanalysis. She imagined presenting this to him at 0800, watching his dismissive smile, hearing him explain in his patient, condescending tone how she'd misunderstood the data, how her unconventional method wasn't accepted practice, how she should focus on her assigned intercepts instead of chasing phantoms. By the time he finished patronizing her and finally examined her work seriously, if he ever did, The morning shift change would have passed. The Soviets would complete their scheduled communications check, and the network would realize someone was listening. She pulled another transmission from the stack, with hands that left damp fingerprints on the paper, applied her Orther's frequency method with growing mechanical precision, and watched a second name emerge from the mathematical melody. Commander James Holloway, Naval Intelligence, Pacific Fleet Coordination. Then a third transmission yielded another operative, this one embedded in the State Department's Soviet Affairs desk, perfectly positioned to know every diplomatic strategy before it reached Moscow through official channels. Anna's breath came shallow and quick, the fluorescent lights above buzzing like trapped insects, and she understood she was facing an impossible choice that would define everything that followed. The clock on the wall read 3 minutes past midnight when she made her decision, bypassing every protocol she'd been taught, reaching instead for the red telephone that connected directly to the operations director's emergency line, knowing this single call would either validate her completely or end her career before it truly began. The red telephone's buzz died into silence as Operations Director Walsh barked his arrival time of 20 minutes, leaving Anna alone with towers of intercepted transmissions that now looked less like paperwork and more like archaeology of treason. Her father's method became a kind of fever dream machinery, her hands moving through frequency conversions and mathematical translations with possessed urgency, each calculation revealing another ghost embedded in America's defense infrastructure. The night shift skeleton crew worked 3 floors below, their distant typewriter clatter a rhythm section to her desperate symphony of discovery, while she filled page after page with names that would trigger earthquakes through the intelligence community. Coffee went cold in a chipped mug beside her as transmission number 4 yielded a defense contractor in Los Angeles, someone with access to missile guidance specifications. And Anna felt history accelerating around her like a train approaching terminal velocity. She developed a system born of pure necessity, sorting intercepts by signal strength and date stamps, prioritizing the most recent communications first, because those operatives were still active, still feeding secrets to Moscow while she raced against the clock of their next scheduled contact. Her notepad became a battlefield map of penetration, red pencil marking each confirmed asset, while her left hand maintained the frequency calculations her father had taught her during those long evenings in their Baltimore row house, his trembling fingers guiding hers through pattern recognition that Soviet training schools never anticipated. The building's heating system clanked and hissed through ancient pipes, a mechanical breathing that made Arlington Hall feel alive and watching, complicit. Somehow, in the secrets breeding within its walls. By the time she heard Walsh's footsteps echoing down the corridor, she'd processed 11 more transmissions and uncovered a network so vast it seemed impossible, a conspiracy so carefully constructed it had operated invisible for years. Walsh arrived with 2 stone-faced men carrying sidearms, their credentials identifying them as counterintelligence specialists, and Anna watched her career's defining moment unfold as she spread decoded messages across the desk like playing cards revealing an unbeatable hand. The elder specialist, a man whose grey eyes held winters of interrogations, lifted the first decryption and read it with expression locked behind professional discipline, then reached for his secure line without speaking a single word. Walsh stood behind Anna's chair, his hand briefly touching her shoulder in acknowledgement that felt like battlefield commission, while she explained her father's frequency method in rapid technical sentences that transformed her from dismissed clerk into the most important analyst in American intelligence. Through the window, Washington's monuments stood floodlit against darkness, marble guardians unaware that their protection had been compromised by 231 calculated betrayals. The room filled with senior personnel as night yielded toward dawn, each decoded name-triggering phone calls that rippled outward through FBI field offices and military intelligence stations, a cascade of quiet arrests beginning before sunrise could warn the network. Anna maintained her mathematical rhythm even as exhaustion blurred her vision, because 17 transmissions remained unprocessed, and each might contain another operative, another penetration that could cost lives or lose wars. Her fingertips were stained with carbon paper and red pencil, her blouse wrinkled beyond respectability. But she'd become something unprecedented in that long night, a woman whose unconventional genius had cracked open the Cold War's most devastating secret. The last decryption emerged at 6:17 in the morning, completing the network of 231 names, and Anna finally set down her pencil as pale light filtered through Venetian blinds, transforming Arlington Hall from nightmare factory into something almost ordinary. Though nothing would ever be ordinary again, the magnitude crystallized when Walsh spread Anna's decoded transmissions across the conference table like a cartographer mapping an invasion, each document representing not just a name, but a precise geographical coordinate where Soviet intelligence had planted roots deep into Western soil. Her father's frequency method had unlocked more than messages. It had revealed a three-dimensional chess game played across 2 continents, with assets positioned in concentric circles radiating outward from Washington, like ripples from a stone thrown into dark water. The 231 identities form patterns within patterns, sleeper agents in university physics departments connected to active operatives inside aerospace firms, each node carefully placed to verify and cross-reference stolen intelligence before it traveled to Moscow. Anna traced these connections with red thread on a wall map, while counterintelligence specialists photographed her work, the web of conspiracy becoming visible as dawn light strengthened outside, transforming abstraction into terrible geography. What made the discovery unprecedented wasn't merely the numbers, but the systematic architecture it exposed. A Soviet penetration operation that had been running parallel to official diplomatic relations for nearly a decade without triggering a single counterintelligence alarm. Anna's decryptions revealed code names paired with precise locations, a signals analyst in London, a parliamentary aide in Ottawa, research scientists in Paris and Rome, all reporting through handlers who themselves appeared in the frequency-coded messages, like ghosts confirming other ghosts. Walsh explained to arriving officials how the musical frequency method had bypassed traditional cryptanalysis entirely, finding messages hidden within already encrypted communications the way harmonics exist within musical notes. And Anna watched hardened intelligence veterans struggle to comprehend the elegant brutality of Soviet tradecraft. Her notepad, filled with questions, shouted across the room as analysts triangulated each revelation against existing surveillance files, discovering that dozens of these assets had been investigated previously but cleared because no one had imagined the encryption within encryption. The operational response began before the last transmission was decoded. FBI teams dispatched with arrest warrants sealed by federal judges roused from sleep, each apprehension timed to occur simultaneously across 4 time zones, so no operative could warn the others. Anna listened to secure telephone reports filtering back through Walsh's office, a defense contractor taken into custody in Los Angeles, a State Department translator arrested in Manhattan, a naval intelligence officer detained in Norfolk before his morning commute. The Cold War's shadow conflict was becoming suddenly violently real in living rooms and office buildings across the nation. Invisible war made visible through her father's pattern recognition genius and her own desperate conviction during one extraordinary night. She understood even then, watching senior officials discuss classification protocols and need-to-know restrictions, that this victory would be buried beneath layers of secrecy so complete it might never surface. Yet the strategic impact would reshape intelligence operations for decades to come, 231 Soviet assets neutralized in a single coordinated sweep that left Moscow's networks blind and broken. Their carefully constructed architecture collapsed by one cipher clerk who had learned to hear patterns in frequencies where others heard only static noise. Anna sat at the conference table as the city awakened outside, exhaustion settling into her bones like winter cold, while men in dark suits discussed her discovery using words like unprecedented and catastrophic and counterintelligence miracle. Her coffee had gone ice cold hours ago, but she drank it anyway, tasting bitterness and triumph mixed together, knowing she had changed history even if history would never speak her name. The first arrests happened while most of America still slept, federal agents moving through pre-dawn darkness with warrants that carried the weight of national emergency and presidential authorization. Anna watched Walsh coordinate the operations from Arlington Hall's command center, his voice crisp and methodical as he directed teams across time zones, each apprehension choreographed with military precision to prevent any Soviet operative from detecting the coordinated sweep. She listened to radio transmissions crackling through speakers mounted on the operations room wall, confirmations delivered in terse code phrases that meant another name from her list had been taken into custody without incident. Another thread in Moscow's intelligence web severed cleanly. The magnitude of what she had set in motion pressed against her chest like physical weight. 231 lives, about to be shattered or transformed because she had heard music in static during a solitary night shift. Walsh glanced at her between telephone calls, his expression mixing professional satisfaction with something approaching awe. And Anna understood she was witnessing counterintelligence history being written in real time around her father's radical mathematical theories. Director Morrison arrived as dawn broke across the Potomac, his motorcade sweeping through security checkpoints with an urgency that sent junior analysts scattering from hallways like startled birds. He studied Anna's evidence spread across the conference table, decoded transmissions, frequency charts, the red thread map showing Soviet penetration reaching deep into Western institutions, while Walsh provided situation briefings punctuated by incoming arrest confirmations from field offices nationwide. Morrison asked Anna direct questions about her methodology, his grey eyes sharp despite the early hour, and she explained the musical frequency principle with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and accumulated tension. The room filled gradually with senior officials carrying classification stamps and legal documents, their dark suits and serious faces transforming the space into something resembling a war tribunal convened to address invisible invasion. Anna felt herself becoming peripheral to discussions about prosecution strategies and diplomatic implications, her contribution already being absorbed into institutional machinery that would grind it into classified powder. The operational tempo accelerated through morning. Hours as European arrests began coordinating with American detentions, creating a transatlantic wave of apprehensions timed to Moscow's afternoon when Soviet handlers would be least able to respond effectively. Anna heard reports filtered through Walsh's telephone conversations, a parliamentary aide taken into custody in Ottawa, research scientists detained in Paris and Rome, assets in London and Brussels, secured by counterintelligence teams who'd been briefed on her discoveries just hours earlier. The scope expanded beyond anything she had imagined during her solitary night shift, her pattern recognition triggering a cascade that was dismantling Soviet intelligence architecture built patiently across nearly a decade of Cold War maneuvering. She watched senior officials mark locations on wall maps with black pins, each one representing a life redirected, an operation terminated, Moscow's carefully constructed networks collapsing like buildings demolish in controlled sequences. Morrison pulled Anna aside as emergency meetings continued around them, his voice dropping to confidential tones that carried both gratitude and warning about what came next. He explained that her name would be removed from all official documentation, her contribution buried beneath classification levels so restrictive that even most intelligence personnel would never know the truth about how 231 Soviet assets were identified and neutralized. Anna nodded understanding, while feeling history close over her accomplishment like dark water, knowing her victory would exist only in sealed files and whispered legends among those few who carried such secrets. Morrison's handshake felt formal and final, a gesture acknowledging extraordinary service that could never be publicly recognized, and Anna walked back into morning sunlight, carrying knowledge that would remain locked inside her for decades to come. The paperwork began that same afternoon, classification stamps descending on her reports like iron curtains, each red imprint transforming truth into official secret that would remain sealed for generations. Anna watched archivists box her frequency charts and decoded transmissions, documents disappearing into metal containers that would be transported to underground facilities she had only heard whispered about in Arlington Hall corridors. Walsh supervised the sanitization process with meticulous attention, personally reviewing every page that mentioned her contribution, striking her name with heavy black ink until nothing remained except anonymous references to signals analysis personnel and cryptographic discovery. She understood the necessity intellectually. Protecting her father's technique meant protecting future operations. But watching her, identity erased, felt like witnessing her own burial while still breathing. The official report credited collective effort rather than individual breakthrough, distributing recognition across departments and committees that had actually dismissed her initial findings as meaningless static. Anna read the revised narrative during her final briefing, seeing her solitary night shift transformed into coordinated team analysis, her father's musical frequency method rewritten as standard cryptographic protocol adapted from existing procedures. Morrison explained that counterintelligence successes required institutional protection, that attributing major discoveries to lone junior analysts created vulnerabilities Moscow could exploit through targeted operations. His reasoning made strategic sense, even as it hollowed out her accomplishment, leaving her with knowledge that her most significant contribution would forever exist in official history as collective institutional achievement rather than personal courage and unconventional thinking. They reassigned her to different sections after that, rotating Anna through administrative positions that kept her away from active cryptanalysis and the colleagues who might remember her breakthrough. She processed personnel files in windowless offices, reviewed supply requisitions for field stations, became deliberately forgettable within. Bureaucratic machinery designed to obscure rather than illuminate truth. Other analysts whispered occasionally about the mysterious October operation that had neutralized hundreds of Soviet assets overnight, speculations swirling through break rooms like cigarette smoke. But nobody connected the quiet woman filing reports to that legendary counterintelligence triumph. Anna carried her secret through promotion ceremonies that celebrated others, through retirement dinners where senior officials toasted accomplishments they could never publicly acknowledge, through decades of silence that felt simultaneously like sacrifice and erasure. The classified stamp on her personnel file read, Level 7 restricted access, compartmented information, in red letters that would remain sealed until congressional review committees finally declassified Cold War operations 50 years later. By then, Anna would be elderly, her father long dead, the Soviet Union dissolved into history, alongside the secrets that had once seemed vital enough to bury individual recognition beneath national security imperatives. She kept newspaper clippings about unexplained diplomatic expulsions and mysterious intelligence personnel transfers during those October days, private evidence connecting public events to her invisible contribution, proof she had existed at the center of history even if official. Records said otherwise. The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, decades after the Berlin Wall had fallen and the Soviet archives had begun their slow hemorrhage of secrets into public record. Anna sat in her kitchen surrounded by the ordinary debris of elderly life, prescription bottles lined like soldiers along the windowsill, crossword puzzles half completed in fading ink, photographs of grandchildren she had raised, with stories that always stopped short of explaining what she had actually done during those classified years. The return address read, National Archives and Records Administration, the weight of the package suggesting substantial documentation. Rather than bureaucratic formality, her hands trembled not from age, but recognition as she broke the seal, understanding immediately that 50 years of silence were ending whether she was ready or not. Inside lay photocopies of reports she had written during that October night shift, her name restored in margins where black redaction ink had finally been chemically lifted after congressional review committees deemed Cold War cryptographic methods sufficiently obsolete to declassify. She read her own words from across half a century, that younger woman's voice describing musical frequency analysis and hidden secondary encryption layers with precision that now seemed almost naive in its confidence that truth would matter more than institutional convenience. Accompanying documents included inter-agency correspondence she had never seen, memoranda from FBI directors and CIA station chiefs discussing operational impacts of the Volkov method across European theaters. Attribution she had never known existed even in classified form. Walsh had written a classified assessment before his own retirement, buried deep in restricted files, explicitly crediting her breakthrough and recommending recognition that would remain sealed until both of them were too old to care about vindication. The phone began ringing within hours as journalists discovered her name in newly released documents, researchers writing Cold War histories suddenly possessing a protagonist for stories previously told through institutional abstractions and anonymous analysts. Anna gave carefully measured interviews from her living room, describing pattern recognition and frequency analysis without revealing techniques that might still hold classified protection, explaining her father's mathematical theories to reporters who struggled to understand how musical notation could unlock Soviet cipher systems. She watched younger women particularly, intelligence professionals and cryptographers who listened with intensity that suggested they knew how many contributions remained buried in classified archives, how many breakthrough moments had been attributed to committees rather than individuals who had actually achieved them. Television producers wanted dramatic recreations. Documentary filmmakers requested access to her preserved frequency charts. Academics proposed book collaborations that would establish her place in espionage history alongside more celebrated codebreakers. But Anna kept returning to Walsh's final memo, his handwritten note in margins of official reports acknowledging what institutional machinery had deliberately obscured for reasons that had seemed vital during nuclear standoffs, but now felt like casual erasure of individual courage. He had known, even while supervising her bureaucratic burial, that history would eventually surface truth despite classification stamps and redacted documents, that secrets kept for national security would become historical record once the nations themselves transformed beyond recognition. She placed his letter beside her father's photograph on the mantel, two men who had understood that patterns revealed themselves eventually, regardless of how deeply buried, that mathematics and time would always decode what fear and necessity had encrypted. Recognition arrived too late for celebration, but exactly when needed for vindication, proof that her single night shift had mattered as profoundly as she had always known it. What secrets from your own life would you want history to remember? Subscribe to uncover more hidden stories that changed the world.